Okay, good evening. Tonight what I'm going to do is cover the last three FRQs of the monetary policy unit for unit 4. And that'll be it for tonight. Tomorrow when we meet, I will cover unit 5 and a few of the practice questions for unit 5. And from then on out, I'll just be there to review with you guys if you have questions. So let me present my screen. Okay, what we're going to cover tonight. In the earlier video that I shared with everybody here today, I covered the monetary policy unit and then this FRQ and this FRQ. So tonight I'm going to cover slides 73, 74, and 75. And what I did is I copied and pasted them right here. So you can see them a little easier and I can do some editing to them. So if you would like, you can pause the video and try out some of these practice problems, or you can try out slides 73, 74, and 75 on your own and then play this video when you're done to check your work. Whatever works for you. It's up to you. Okay. You got a T-chart here, very simplified version of a T-chart, which shows the reserves of a bank. I thought I made a typo. Yep. Say that does not add up. 1,200 is not equal to 2,000. Remember, assets have to equal liabilities. So good thing I caught that. All right, so you got $200 in reserves. Remember, whenever you see reserves, it's talking about your required and excess reserves. It put those two things together. You got your demand deposits over here. There's no owner's equity, and the bank has made $1,800 in loans. So 1,800 plus 200 equals 2,000, and you have 2,000 over here. They equal each other. Perfect. The bank's got a reserve requirement of 10%. Right? So, question A, what is the dollar value of new loans that this bank can make? Explain. All right, so here's how you would break down a question like that. What they're asking is, does the bank have any excess reserves to give to somebody, to loan to somebody, if a customer was to walk in their doors and ask for a loan? Do they have money to loan out? And what you would do, look at their demand deposits. Remember, the 10% reserve requirement is based off of a bank's demand deposits. So if you were to take 10%, $2,000, that would be $200, which means that the bank has to keep $200 in required reserves. So if you look at their reserves here, they only have $200 in there, and they got to hold on to that. They cannot loan that out. By law, they have to hold on to that. So, correct answer here, bank can make no loans due to the reserve requirement and having no excess reserves. Form an answer, something around that. Remember, anytime it says explain right here, they're looking for a 1 to 2 sentence argument, causal relationship for why the bank cannot make any loans, because they don't have any money to make loans. All right, part B. Mr. Smith takes $100. He's a customer at the bank and puts it into a demand deposit account. We're assuming a checking account. Calculate the maximum amount of new loans that First Superior can make. All right, so this is based off of that 10%. Okay, so if you were to take 10% of $100, it would be $10. That means that the bank has to hold on to $10, and which means, let me scroll down a little bit here, which means that since the bank has to hold $10, that leaves how much left over? $90 in loans, essentially asking for the excess reserves. So of that $100 deposit, they can make $90 in loans if they wanted to. Okay. Part C, as a result of Mr. Smith's $100 deposit, calculate. Here's where you got to show your work. Remember, anytime you see calculate, maximum change over time in each of the following in the banking system. Whenever you're looking for loans, think back to this I talked about earlier. Find the maximum change in the money supply or loans. It's your multiplier times the excess reserves that were created. So what you would do here, and again, you got to show your work. Okay, so first find your multiplier. So 1 divided by 0.10, remember you got to show your work, is 10. 10 times the excess reserves that were created means that the bank can make $900, or this could lead to the creation of $900 in new loans. All right. Demand deposits. Again, find your multiplier. 1 divided by 0.10 times the original deposit of $100. It's going to lead to, or it could lead to, $1,000 in demand deposits being created. Remember, the difference between the money supply or loans and demand deposits is the difference of the original deposit. So notice that there's a $100 difference here between the change in loans, maximum over time, and the change in demand deposits, maximum over time. Difference of $100. Okay? Same thing here, kind of a repeating question. What you're going to do, your multiplier is 10. 10 times $90, $900. Okay? Remember, the change in the money supply is always going to be less than demand deposits because you can't count this original $100 deposit. This is cash that's already been in circulation in the money supply. Keep that in mind. Part E, provide one reason why the actual change in the money supply could be smaller than the maximum change you identified in Part D. So what it's saying here is it's possible that the money supply might only change by $200 or $500. Why? Form an answer around this. Banks don't have to loan all of that out. So if you go back up here, when Mr. Smith put that money into the bank, they have $90 now in excess reserves. That doesn't mean that they have to loan it. They have to do something with it. If they wanted to just keep it in their vaults, that $90, they could do that. So you would form an answer around the bank does not have to loan out the entire amount. And that would suffice. Okay? This is from slide 74. This would be question 5. Assume that the reserve requirement is now 20% and banks are not holding any excess reserves. That means with any excess reserves that the bank has, they are loaning it out. All right. So here's the scenario. Kim takes $100 of cash. So right there, underline some of these things. $100 in cash, 20% reserve requirement. Those are big numbers that you're going to use to conquer questions like this. $100 in cash, puts it in the checking account. Now remember that $100 of cash is already part of the money supply. Keep that in mind. Calculate maximum dollar amount that the bank can initially lend. All right, initially. There's another key term there. We're not talking about maximum change over time. We're talking about right now, of that $100, how much could the bank lend out? So here's how you'd figure something like that out. Okay, you would take 20% of $100 is $20. So the bank can lend out what's left over? $80. That's the maximum dollar amount that the bank can initially lend out. Okay. Now for A2, you have to find the maximum total change in demand deposits in the banking system. So this is very similar to the previous question. The first thing you got to do, remember, find the multiplier. 1 divided by 0.20 would be 5. Okay. 5 times your original deposit of $100, and that would be $500. Okay. So the change in demand deposits over time would be $500. And now, again, you got to show your math, but some of you might already know the answer because this is going to be, we're looking for the change in the money supply. Remember, the change in the money supply is always going to be less than the change in demand deposits by the amount of the original deposit. So it's going to be $400. But if you're wondering how to show that. 1 divided by 0.20 again is 5 times the excess reserves created, $80, 400. 5 times 80 is 400. Okay. Here's a Federal Reserve question. So the Federal Reserve comes in and they buy up $5 million in bonds on the open market. So essentially what they're doing is they're giving $5 million to the banks, and in return they get $5 million in bonds back. That's expansionary policy. The money supply is increasing. Okay. We're assuming that the reserve requirement is the same. So here's how that would look. 1 divided by 0.20 again. This is getting redundant. Is 5 times the $5 million bond purchase, and you're going to have $25 million increase, maximum increase in the money supply. Remember, you got to show your work. So what the AP is looking for here is they're showing for evidence that you can figure out a multiplier and how to use that multiplier. If you show your work similar to what I just did, you will get credit. But if you were just to write, like for A2, just 500, or for this one, 25 million, you're not going to get the credit. You've got to be able to show your work on this exam. All right. I mentioned that scenario B there. The Fed is pumping money into the economy. That's an example of expansionary policy. You're going to have a rightward shift in the money supply because it's increasing. And so when the money supply is increasing, more people have more money in their pockets. Businesses have more to lend out. The government's spending more, all that good stuff, okay? So if you look at this aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph here, look what's happening to aggregate demand. As a result of the increase in the money supply, aggregate demand shifts right, and look what happens to prices. Prices are now rising, so you have inflation. The reason I bring that up is you have to figure out the effect on real wages. We're talking about the short run here. Remember, anytime there's inflation, think of the effect on real wages. It eats into people's real wages. Now your money purchases less. Your purchasing power is reduced. So the correct answer here would be real wages fall due to the increased inflation caused by the, you could say the positive demand shock, increase in demand, whatever you want to write. That would suffice. Okay. So that's the 5th question. We got one more. Here's the final one for tonight. In recent years, the Federal Reserve has been targeting the federal funds rate as a focus of its monetary policy. All right. So by seeing that, federal funds rate, we'll probably be talking about the federal funds rate. So the first thing that they ask, define the federal funds rate. The rate of interest charged to banks that borrow from, now you got 2 options here. They either borrow from the Fed or they borrow from other banks that borrow from other banks. And if you wanted to include, you don't have to, but if you wanted to, that borrow from other banks to cover their reserve requirements or cover the shortfall in their reserve requirements, whatever you wanted to put. So federal funds rate, banks borrowing from other banks. Discount rate, banks borrowing from the Fed. Got to know that. Part B, if the Federal Reserve wants to lower the federal funds rate, I can't speak anymore. Okay, they're looking for an open market operation. So the thing that should come into mind here, bonds. Anytime open market operations are mentioned, it's just bonds. And in this case, it's a multiple choice question, really, if you know it's bonds. They're either going to be buying bonds or selling bonds. Key is this. They want to lower the federal funds rate. So essentially, they're lowering interest rates. The Fed wants to lower interest rates. Think about that money market graph. And I could show it, pull you up a copy here. Okay, here's your money market graph. So if this is your money supply curve right here, here's your interest rate. How is it going to fall? Well, it's going to fall by shifting right. The supply of money is going to shift right. It's going to be out here. I wish I could edit this, but I can't. And so then the interest rate's going to fall. So when this shifts right, what's the Fed doing with bonds? They're buying them. So the Fed would be buying bonds. Oh boy. Part C. Assume that the open market operation you indicated in Part B is equal to $10 million. So what that's saying is, what that first sentence of Part C is saying is, the Fed is pumping $10 million worth of money into the economy, or they've bought $10 million in bonds. If the reserve required ratio is 0.2, calculate the maximum change in loans over time throughout the banking system, right? So the banks have $10 million now. And as they loan that out, that money is going to become demand deposits. You know, money that people have in their pockets, they're going to put it in their banks, and then the banks have to hold some of it. So here's how you would tackle a question like this. All right, the reserve required ratio is 0.2. So 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. It's a very common one. You'll probably see that on the exam most likely. It's 5. And then 5 times 8. Because of that 10 million, 2 million of it is going to be held by the banks in reserves. 5 times 8, 0. Come on, Clark. It's 40 million. That would be the change in loans throughout the banking system. That means over time, it's not the change in money supply we're looking at here. We're looking at the change in loans, meaning because banks are going to have to keep 20% of all this money over time because it's going to become demand deposits. This one's a little tricky. So if you take out 20%, that leaves 8 million over. 8 million times the multiplier would be $40 million. Last two parts. Indicate the effect of the open market operation that you indicated in Part B on the nominal interest rate. Oh, and I did have a graph. It's right here. Okay, so the Fed's buying bonds. It's increasing the money supply. Look what happens to the nominal interest rate. It's decreasing. Okay. Okay. That's all you got to do there. Here's an explain question. You got to be able to explain this. Assume that the Federal Reserve's action results in some inflation, which is probably going to happen because this is expansionary policy. You're growing the economy. Prices are going to rise as a result of this because there's more money in the economy. What's the impact of the open market operation on the real rate of interest? So now this is where you would use your loanable funds graph. Don't worry about the caption up top there. I just copied and pasted something from the internet. So because banks have more money in their vaults, as a result of the Fed pumping money in the economy, they're going to be willing to supply more loans. So as they supply more loans, look what happens to the real rate of interest. The real rate of interest falls. Okay? This is where, and this is, guys, just like with this one and the previous question, if you're able to graph questions like this, like D and E and B, you're going to be in such good shape on this exam because you'll be able to graph things on your own, and usually the graphs will lead you to the answer. Okay, so the real rate of interest will decrease due to the increase in the supply of loans. I got it right. Okay. So those were the last 3 FRQs for tonight. You're welcome to go back and watch the video that I made earlier today, or watch this one over again, or check out the videos that I linked in the presentation. Tomorrow, I will cover Unit 5, which is short and long-run growth, and Unit 5 looks at things related to the Phillips curve, crowding out, combinations of fiscal and monetary policy, long-run economic growth, and the quantity theory of money. And that's it. So I hope you're studying, and feel free to jump on tomorrow in any Google Meets and ask me questions. And I hope you're all doing well out there. Have a good night.